Hey everyone, in this video we are going to be creating a weather app using Streamlit and OpenAI, and in order to get information about the weather, we are going to be using the Open Weather Map API. It is an online service owned by the Open Weather Limited that provides global weather data via API, including current weather data, forecast, nowcast, and historical weather data. So let's start the action. I have created a new project inside my PyCharm IDE, and I have created a file called requirements.txt which contains all the packages that will be necessary in order to create the weather app. And these packages are Streamlit in order to create the front end, request in order to interact with the Open Weather Map API, and OpenAI in order to create a description from the generated weather results. Okay, so in order to install all of these packages directly at once, you have to go to the terminal and write the command pip install -r, and then you have to run requirements.txt, which is the name of our file. Hit enter and it is going to install all of the packages which are present inside this text file all at once. Alright, so once the packages are successfully installed, now the next step is to actually import the necessary libraries from these packages. So let's go ahead and do it. So here I'm gonna import the Streamlit as st, importing the requests and OpenAI, and these are the only three libraries that we will be using in order to create the weather app. After that, let's go ahead and create the front end of our application. For that, I'm gonna define the main function, inside which I'm going to add all the components which will be present on our user interface. So firstly, I'm creating a sidebar by using the streamlit.sidebar.title to set the sidebar configuration. And the title of the sidebar is gonna be weather forecasting with LLM. Then I want to have a text input inside my sidebar, so I'm gonna use the sidebar.text input, and the text on the text box is gonna be enter the city name, and the default value is London. You can also leave the default value to be null, but I am setting the default values to be London, and whatever value the user will input inside this text box will be stored inside the variable called city. After that, we need to set the API keys. Here, since we are using two different APIs, first is the OpenAI API and the other one is the Open Weather Map API. So we need to have the API keys for both of these APIs. So firstly, I've created a new variable called weather API key, to which I've assigned the value of a newly generated API key. Then I've also generated an API key for my OpenAI API, and I've placed the value here. So in order to use the API for the Open Weather Map API, you have to go to their website, and from here you will have these options. You have to click on the API keys, and it is going to show you the APIs. You can either use the already existing one, or you can also generate a new API key for your application. Okay, then below it we have a button to fetch and display the weather data. This button is also supposed to be placed inside the sidebar, so I'm using streamlit.sidebar.button. The text on the button is going to be the get weather, and the state of the button will be stored inside a variable called submit. Now let's go ahead and run our application to see the user interface. So head to your terminal and type the command streamlit run, and then provide the name of your file, which in my case is app.py, and it has to be streamlit run. Okay, hit enter. And it is going to open a new browser window for you, and inside a new tab, your application's front end will appear. So here we have the sidebar. This is the title of the sidebar. Here we have a text input and a button saying get weather. So you can add any city here, and once you click on get weather, it should display the weather information for that city here on the main page of our user interface. So now let's go ahead and write the code in order to display the weather updates for the city which a user will enter in this text box. So firstly, I'm going to define a function that is going to fetch the weather updates from the Open Map API. So the name of my function is going to be the get weather data. It is going to take two values as a parameter. First one is going to be the city name, which the user will input inside the text box. And the second one is the weather API key, which we have set here in the API keys. Then inside this function, you have to define the base URL, complete URL, and then get the response by sending the request. So for the base URL, you have to provide the link of the API that provides you the weather updates, which is going to be the base URL. Then in order to generate the complete URL, you have to use base URL plus app ID, which is actually going to be the weather AI API key. And then for the Q parameter, you have to pass the city. So the base URL, the weather API key, and the city collectively will generate the complete URL, which is going to generate the response for us. Okay, so once the complete URL is generated, now we are going to use the requests.get function, inside which we'll pass our URL. So this request will go to this URL and will fetch the response for us, which will be stored inside the variable called response. So the weather update for this city will be fetched from this base URL and will be stored in this variable called response. And then finally, we are returning the response as a JSON, which means that we'll have the data in the form of key value pairs. Okay, so in this way, we will get the weather updates for our provided city. Now we also want to create a description using the OpenAI for this data. And for that, I'm going to create a new function. I'm going to call it generate weather description. And it is going to take two values as a parameter. First one is going to be the data, which is the response generated by the get weather data function. And the second one is going to be the OpenAI API key, because we are going to be using the OpenAI key in order to generate a brief description of the provided weather updates. Okay, so inside this function, we will be assigning the OpenAI API key to OpenAI.API key in order to use it further. Then, since we have the data as the parameter as well, now we are gonna fetch the required values from this data in order to generate a description for our weather updates. So from here, firstly, I'm going to extract the temperature from the data by using data main temp and converting it to Celsius from Kelvin. Don't worry about these two values. I'll explain it later on once we actually fetch the data from the API. Then similarly, I'm also going to extract the description from the data by using the data. Then inside it, we have the weather and the index zeros description. And then using this temperature and the description, we are going to generate the prompt that is going to say the current weather in your city is, and the description will provide the weather update for the city with a temperature of, and this is the temperature that we have fetched from the data, and we are going to convert it to degrees centigrade. And we are further giving it the prompt, explain this in a simple way for a general audience. So we are going to provide it the prompt about the weather updates, which is the description plus the temperature of the city, and we are asking it to explain it in a simple way for the general audience. Okay, then we are going to use OpenAI.completion.create, inside which we are going to define our engine, which will be GPT 3.5 Turbo Instruct in my case. Then for the prompt, I'm going to pass this prompt variable and the max tokens is 60. So in this way, we do not have to initialize the OpenAI separately and then pass the prompt and get the response. By using OpenAI.completion.create, we are initializing the OpenAI and also running the prompt to get the response simultaneously. So once all of these instructions will execute, it is going to generate the response for our prompt, which will be stored inside this response variable. And then simply we are going to return the response.choices.text.strip. And this is being done to extract the main content of the GPT model's response in a clean format without any leading or trailing white spaces. So any leading or trailing white spaces will be removed by using this strip function. So overall, this function is going to extract the temperature and description from our weather updates provided by the Open Weather Map API, and is going to generate a prompt to convert it into user understandable description. And once we run the prompt, then the response of this prompt will be stored inside this response variable, and we are actually cleaning the response and returning it. Also, this might throw us an exception. So in order to prevent it, we are enclosing it in a try block. And if an exception occurs, then we are simply returning the string of the exception. And in case of no exception, the response which is generated by OpenAI for our prompt will be returned. Now we have to actually get this data and the description and display it on the user interface. So I'm going to move to my main function, and we want all of these responses to be generated once the button is clicked. So firstly, we are going to check the state of the button, that if the button is clicked. Then on our main page, firstly, we are going to show it the title that says weather updates for the city is, and this city is actually going to be the city which the user will enter inside the text box which is present in the sidebar. So the title will say weather updates for the city is. Then we are going to create a spinner that will say fetching the weather data, and in the meantime, it is going to call the get weather data function by providing its city and the weather API key. So the get weather data function, which is this function, is going to generate the complete URL on the basis of the base URL, weather API key and the city, and will get the response for our weather updates and will return the response in the form of JSON. And that response will be stored inside the variable called weather data. So once we'll get the weather data in the form of JSON, now let's go ahead and print it to see how the data actually is and what are the fields which are present inside the response generated by the API. So my project is already running. I'm gonna click on rerun, and then for the city, I'm gonna leave it to London and click on get weather. So it has shown me the weather updates for the London is, since we have not displayed anything below it. So it is only showing us the weather updates for the city. There was also a spinner and we have printed the weather data. So now let's go to the terminal and you can see that this is the weather data for the London. And these are all the values which are present inside our response in the form of JSON. So you can see that here we have the location coordinates, we have the weather inside which we have the description as the clear sky, we have an icon. Then for the main, we also have the temperature, which is in Kelvin right now. There is minimum temperature, maximum temperature, pressure, humidity, visibility. Then we also have the wind speed, the angle at which the wind is blowing, and all of these information about the London's weather. Okay, so in this way, we can fetch all of these values from the response. So now I'm gonna explain you how we generated the description and the temperature from the data which was fetched from the API. So in the generate weather description, if you see that in order to convert the temperature from Kelvin to Celsius and storing it inside a new variable, I'm heading to the data, which is the data that we have fetched using the API. So from this data, we are actually fetching the key having title main. So if you go to this JSON, you can see that here we have a key whose title is main, which is this one. And then inside this main, we want to get the key whose title is temperature. So then inside this main, we have a key whose title is temperature. So we are getting this value and we are subtracting 273.15 from it in order to convert Kelvin to Celsius. Then in order to get the description, we are moving inside the data, and inside the data we have a key with the title weather. So here inside the data we have a key with the title weather, and inside this weather you can see that we have a description. But since this weather has all the data present inside it in the form of list, so we have to provide the index number. So here, in order to get the description, we are using data and then accessing the key whose title is weather, and then inside the weather list we are going towards the index 0 because we have a single record, and then we are moving towards the description, which in this case is clear sky. So in this way, clear sky will be stored inside the description, and using the temperature and description, we will generate a prompt. Now, in order to display the weather updates on our UI, we need to fetch certain component from this response. So I want to display the temperature for the city, the pressure, the humidity, and the wind speed for the city which the user will enter. So just like I fetch the temperature and description in order to generate the prompt from the response, similarly I am going to get these values from the response which is generated by the API. So now let's go ahead and do it. So firstly, I'm gonna go ahead and check if the weather data.get COD. COD is actually a field that contains the status code for the response. So we are checking that if the status code is not equal to 404, which means not found. So if the status code is not equal to 404, this means that we have fetched the response. So if we have fetched the response, then we are going to create two columns inside our user interface by using the Streamlit, and we are going to call it column 1 and column 2. This is being done in order to have our 4 fields inside 2 columns. And then for the first column, we are going to use the Streamlit.metric function, and the first metric is gonna be the temperature, and we are using an F string to convert all of this formula into a string. So here inside it, we are moving inside the weather data, which is this JSON value, and we are moving inside it to the key having the title main, which is this key here. And then inside this main, we want to fetch the temperature. So inside this main key, we have another key called temperature, whose value is 275.43. So we are actually fetching it and converting it to degrees centigrade up to 2 decimal values. Then similarly, we'll also fetch the humidity. So the humidity is present inside the main key with the title humidity. So we are gonna use the F string again, and we'll use the weather data main, and inside the main we have the key called humidity, and we'll also show it in the form of a percentage. Okay, then inside the column 2, similarly, we will fetch the pressure and the wind speed from our JSON response and display it using the Streamlit.metric. So on the user interface, we will have 2 columns. In the column 1, we have temperature, below it we will have humidity, and then in the column 2, firstly we will have the pressure, and below it we will have the wind speed for the city. And then simply we are going to call the generate weather description function and pass it the weather data and the OpenAI API key to generate a description for our weather update, which is user friendly. And we are going to store the description inside a variable called weather description. And then finally, after all of these matrices are displayed, we are going to display the description for our weather update. And then below it, we are simply calling an error message if the information is not found. This means that if here the status code is equal to 404, this means that we could not find the city and could not find the weather updates for this city. So in that case, we'll move towards the else clause and we will display that the city not found or an error occurred. Alright, so this is the entire code in order to create the weather application using OpenAI Streamlit and Open Weather Map API. So now I'm gonna go ahead to my user interface and I'm going to rerun my application because I've made a few changes here. Okay, so now inside the city name, instead of London, I'm gonna pass California and hit on Get Weather button. So once you do that, you will have the title saying weather updates for California is, then there was a spinner, and here is the weather updates for the California. So currently the temperature in California is minus 1.66 degrees Celsius, which is quite cold. The pressure is 1024 pascals. Then we have the humidity to be 65%. And the wind speed is 5.14 miles per second. And you can see that there is also some description about the weather, which says the weather outside is cloudy and the temperature is below freezing. And another interesting thing is that if you again click on the Get Weather button, all of the values will be the same, but the description will change because the description is actually being generated using the OpenAI API. Alright, so up till now we have written the code in order to get the current weather update for a particular city. Now let's see how you can actually get the weather forecast for an entire week for the provided city. In order to do that, firstly I'm gonna make a few changes to the user interface. Inside my sidebar above the title, I want to have the logo of our company. So here I'm gonna say streamlit.sidebar.image, and here is the name of the image which is present inside my project directory, and I'm setting its width to be 120. After that, in order to get the weather forecast for the coming entire week, we need to create a new function just like we did previously. So let's go above the main, and then here below this function I'm gonna create a new function. The name of the function is gonna be get weekly forecast, and this function is going to take 3 parameters. First one is the API key of our weather app. Then we want to have a latitude and the longitude. These are the two things which will be necessary in order to get the weekly forecast for the city. So here, this is our base URL in order to access the API of the Open Weather Map. And then in order to generate the complete URL, we are going to concatenate our base URL with the forecast and provide the longitude, latitude, and the app ID, which is our weather API key. So collectively, all of these things will make our complete URL. And once again, we are going to use the request.get method in order to make a connection with the URL, and it is going to generate the response for us. And we are going to return the response in the form of JSON. This response will actually going to contain all the data about all the next 7 days of the week for the city. Alright, so now that we have the weekly forecast for the city, we also need to display this in a specified format. So let's go ahead and do that. In order to display the data which we have fetched from the get weekly forecast function, we are gonna create a new function. The name of this function is gonna be display weekly forecast, and it is going to take the data as the parameter. And this data is actually the response which is generated by our API. Alright, so inside this function, firstly, I am creating a separator to separate the current weather updates with the weekly forecast. This is gonna be a title of our weekly weather forecast. Then let's leave this line for now on. I'm gonna explain it later on. Firstly, inside this function, I am creating 4 new columns because I want to display the day, the description, the minimum temperature, and the maximum temperature for the next entire week for the city. So here I've created 4 columns, and using these lines of code, I am actually setting the title for the 4 columns. So for the first column, the title is going to be the day. It is going to show you the day and the date as well. Then we'll have a brief description of the weather. Then in the third column, we will show the minimum temperature, and in the column 4, we are going to show the maximum temperature. Now in order to fetch the values for these columns, we are gonna iterate through this data which we have passed as a parameter. So this data contains a response in the form of JSON, and this JSON actually contains a list. So we are gonna go inside the data list, and inside this list, each index represents a day. So we are gonna fetch each day from the data list, and then for each day, we are going to fetch the minimum temperature, maximum temperature, description, and date, etc. So inside this for loop, firstly, I am converting the date into a specified format by fetching the dt from the data list. Okay, and we are storing the formatted date inside a variable called date. After that, I am using an if statement, and this is to check if we have already checked that date or not. This is because when the data is returned inside this data list, then there is the weather forecast for multiple intervals of each day. But we only want to get one record for each day. So in order to prevent the duplication of the date, I am using this if condition here. And in the beginning of the function, if you remember that I'm creating this displayed dates to keep track of the dates for which forecast have been displayed. Okay, so now inside this if statement, for each date, firstly, I'm going to check that if this date is not inside the displayed dates, this means that we have not displayed its forecast currently. So firstly, we are going to add this date inside our displayed dates list. Then we are going to get the minimum temperature from our day, as this day list has a key having the title main, and this main has another key having the title temperature minimum. So we are going to fetch the minimum temperature and we are going to convert it to Celsius from Kelvin. Similarly, we are going to fetch the maximum temperature, and similarly we are going to get the description which is present inside the day list having a key titled weather. Then on the index 0 of the weather list, we have a key titled description. So in this way, using this for loop, we will get the date, the minimum temperature and maximum temperature along with the description for each date. And this will be done only once, because we have placed this check here that if the current date is not in already displayed dates, then all of this is gonna happen. If the date is already present, then we are not going to show all of these things. Okay, so once we have fetched the minimum temperature, maximum temperature, date and description, then simply we are gonna go inside the 4 columns that we previously created, and we are going to write these values in the form of f strings. So in the first column, we have the date. So I'm going to display the date as the f string. Then for the second column, we set the title to be description. Here I am printing the description to be capitalized. Then in the third column, we have minimum temperature up to 1 decimal value. And then I am displaying the maximum temperature up to 1 decimal value. And if any exception occurs, then it is going to show us the error, that error in displaying weekly forecast, and will display us the error string. Alright, so we have created 2 new functions. In the first function, we are going to generate a new URL in order to get the weekly forecast for the city. And then we are going to use the requests to actually send a request to the API, and it is going to generate the response for us. And then we are going to simply return this response in the form of JSON. After that, we are creating a new function to display the weekly weather forecast. The name of the function is display weekly forecast, and it is taking this data which is actually the JSON response. Okay, then inside this function, we are fetching the date, description, minimum temperature and maximum temperature. And in order to avoid the duplication, we are checking the date, that if we have already printed the date, then all other records of the same date will not be fetched. Okay, in this way, we will get only a single value for the minimum temperature, maximum temperature and description for each date. And then finally, for each column, we are going to show these values in the form of an f string. Okay, so now the only thing that is left is to call these functions. So let's go to our main function, and then below this line, we are going to call the function to get the weekly forecast. So here I am calling the get weekly forecast function that takes not the city, that takes the weather API key, latitude and the longitude as the parameter. But we have not fetched the latitude and longitude from our data, so let's go ahead and do it. So the longitude and the latitude were present inside the coord, so I'm gonna fetch it from there. So the latitude will be fetched using the weather data key having the title coord, and then inside this coord we have another field having the key latitude. Similarly, we are also going to fetch the value for the longitude, and then we will pass both of these values as the function parameter, and it is going to return us the forecast data for the entire week. Then the next thing is to display this data. So firstly, I'm printing the forecast data in order to show you how it looks like in the raw form. Then we will check if the forecast data.getCOD is not equal to 404. This means that the data has been fetched. Then we are simply going to call the function display weekly forecast data, which is going to display our forecast data for each day of the week in a specified format. And that's all. In this way, we'll also get the weekly forecast for each city provided. Okay, so now let's go ahead and run our application to see how it looks now. Okay, so I'm gonna say Streamlit run, and you have to provide the name of your file, which is app.py in my case. Hit enter. Alright, so the application is running. This is the new interface. Here is the logo of our application that I have set using the streamlit.sidebar.image function. Now let's go ahead and see the weather updates. So for the city name, I'm gonna enter Manchester. Let's click on get weather, and you can see that this is the heading saying the weather updates for Manchester. This is the current weather. The temperature is 1.78 degrees centigrade. The humidity is 86%, wind speed is 2.57 miles per second, and it is also showing us a brief description that right now it is snowing lightly in your city and the temperature is 1.8 degrees Celsius. Then if you scroll down, you can see that here is a separator, and then we have the weekly weather forecast. And for the weekly weather forecast, we have 4 columns for day, description, minimum temperature and maximum temperature, and these are all the days and the minimum temperature, maximum temperature and description for each day. Okay, so in this way, you can get the current weather updates as well as the weekly weather forecast for each provided city. And that's all for this video. I hope that you enjoyed this project as much as I did.